And there is a growing feeling that we may be just days or even hours away from the start of the Kyiv government's long-awaited spring counter-offensive. Shelling along the eastern and the southern fronts has ramped up in the past 48 hours, and Russia has ordered people to evacuate from 18 different towns in the central Zaporizhzhia region, including around its huge nuclear power plant. It's widely expected that Ukrainian forces will try to cut the Russian army in two by pushing all the way down south to the Black Sea coast. Well, we have a special report tonight from the Sun's defence editor, Jerome Starkey, who is on the outskirts of the city of Zaporizhzhia itself. He sent us this.
What we've seen recently is a sort of uptick in the Russian missile strikes across Ukraine. There was a lull, about a 50-day period when there were fewer attacks. And over the last week, we've seen that really come to quite a dramatic end. There have been attacks every single night with drones and cruise missiles. We were in Odessa, where we saw the aftermath of just one of those missiles, which hit a Red Cross depot just on the outskirts of the city and destroyed a 1,000-square-metre warehouse that was packed with mountains of food and water and life-saving aid, and it killed a night watchman. And it was staggering, really, to see the damage that just one missile can cause, not just the loss of life, which was very, very disturbing, but also to see the power of these weapons. And when you see what just one can do, and then imagine, of course, what 20, 30, 40, sometimes 80 are happening in a night, it's very disturbing. So that appears to be part of a bigger campaign on both sides to hit each other's logistics. We know that there have been a number of attacks in occupied Ukraine and indeed on Russian soil against fuel depots and logistics lines, train lines. Now that appears to be an attempt by the Ukrainians or by people supporting the Ukrainians to disrupt Russia's logistics. Now that plays into when the counteroffensive may or may not start. What Ukraine is trying to do is to limit Russia's ability to respond to that offensive when it comes by crippling its logistics. Equally, what Russia is trying to do is limit Ukraine's ability to launch an offensive by hammering its logistics. So a lot of the fighting at the moment is sort of happening behind, or rather over, the front lines as each side tries to hit each other's logistics. In terms of when this counteroffensive may or may not start, Ukraine has been very clear, as have its allies. There are only a handful of people, perhaps 5 people, who know those plans. And of course, they are a very closely guarded secret for obvious reasons. There's some suggestion that actually, in a sense, these offensives have already started. Ukraine is launching offensive operations in parts of the front in eastern Ukraine. What's interesting, in the last few days, we've also heard warnings, or rather sort of attempts to manage expectations from Ukrainian officials, that saying that this offensive will not necessarily be as dramatic or as decisive or as Hollywood as perhaps we in the West, perhaps Ukraine supporters, would like it to be. And clearly part of what they're doing is managing expectations, because they know that a decisive or spectacular victory will galvanize not only their own soldiers and the people here in Ukraine, but crucially it will galvanize Ukraine's international allies. And there is some concern that a failure to deliver such a sort of spectacular attack may lead to a weakening of support among Ukraine's international allies.
Jerome Starkey in Ukraine for us tonight. Well, elsewhere in Ukraine, Russian troops appear to have been dealt a blow in the crucial city of Bakhmut, the site of the longest and the bloodiest battle of the conflict so far. Dramatic footage has emerged showing Russian troops seemingly fleeing the front line there after being overwhelmed by Ukraine's 3rd Assault Brigade. Ukrainian forces claim to have killed 64 Russian soldiers and left many more wounded while capturing hundreds of prisoners. Ukrainian commanders claim to also have pushed Russian forces back up to 2 kilometres in the Bakhmut area. So what can we expect to happen next? Joining me now, the military analyst and senior former RAF officer, Air Vice Marshal Sean Bell. Sean, very good evening to you.
Tom, good evening.
That footage from Bakhmut first, obviously we can't verify, we have to take basically the Ukrainian military's word for it, but pretty embarrassing looking scenes for the Kremlin any which way you look at it.
Well, as you say, this battle's been on for 11 months, and overwhelmingly, this has been a success story for Russia and the Wagner Group, that they have gradually, slowly inched their way forward. They paid a very, very high price for every pace they've taken, allegedly.
25,000 lives?
Well, more than that, some of the estimates, and 100,000 casualties total. So every day there are upwards of 100 different attacks done by Russia. Some of those will end up with them not working and running away. So I think we've got to be careful not to take these things out of context. But I think what's probably most worrying for the Russians at the moment is, and their troops, is they'll know that this Ukrainian counteroffensive is on its way. And you can just imagine those chaps in their trenches suddenly thinking that the offence has started and thinking, I don't want to be any part of this, and running away. So it may portend to how the Ukrainian offence might have, the effect it might have on the psyche of the Russian soldiers.
Yeah, I suppose the big question is, you know, when should the counteroffensive begin? We heard from Jerome there that he thinks the pre-ops are already in place, the shaping operations, the shelling, etc. I mean, you know an awful lot about these things, not more than me. What's your take on what you're seeing now around that frontline area?
I think the Western media tends to expect there to be a fanfare of trumpets and suddenly everybody will
cavalry
set
charge.
off. Yeah. And that's not the way it happens. There'll be a sort of shaping phase to any of this operation, which will not involve troops charging at each other, but will involve taking out logistics supply lines and stuff like that. And I think over the last few days, we've seen oil facilities on Crimea and to the east of the Kerch Bridge being taken out by Ukrainian drones. We've seen railheads being disrupted. All the signs that they're both sides preparing for some sort of offensive, but the only people who know what they're going to be doing are the Ukrainians. And bluntly, even as analysts, I can give you a best guess. There's three main areas where they might do this offensive, but ultimately they don't want to show their cards just yet, and we'll just have to wait and see.
So given they're going to try and cut the Russian army in two, though, and try and get to the sea, isn't it?
Of the three main options, one of which is to try and push towards Crimea, that would be an amphibious assault over the Dnipro River, which would be really difficult to do.
Yeah.
The other one is to actually continue with the Donbass. You remember they were quite successful up at Kharkiv, but that's been a fiercely fought over area, and they would make incremental progress, if at all. So the most obvious route is down south to the east of Zaporizhzhia. That would isolate the troops on the east of the Dnipro River and potentially give the biggest bang for your buck in terms of getting land and territory back.
Sean, one more point, really interesting. Tensions continue to arise internally in Russia, especially between Yevgeny Prigozhin, who runs the Wagner Group, the paramilitary group of mercenaries, now openly today, openly mocking Vladimir Putin in a video, calling him, and this is a direct quote, so excuse the profanity, an arsehole grandfather. What does that all mean?
Yeah, at face value, this looks very damaging. We've been watching Yevgeny over the last few weeks getting very frustrated because his Wagner Group have been doing the lion's share of the fighting in the middle of Bakhmut and now being starved of ammunition by Gerasimov, who runs the Russian army. But inevitably, there's politics behind the scene. Yevgeny and Putin are old friends, so you're never quite sure how much of this is being stage managed. He needs more ammunition to do the fighting. He's being starved of ammunition in a bit of a political play. And so no great surprises that he's waving a lot of hands around, trying to gain attraction and gain attention and get that ammunition that he desperately needs in order to advance in Bakhmut.
OK. Fascinating stuff as always. Sean Bell, thank you so much. Well, before we leave Ukraine, how are Russia's battlefield disasters currently going down with the Kremlin's pet TV propagandists? Well, we can tell you that too, because here's the biggest of them all, Vladimir Salovyov, on his Russia 1 nightly primetime show. He's about the biggest star on Russian television, doubling down on what he thinks Russia's war aims should be.
Приднестровье. Не дойдем до Приднестровья. Чтобы в Приднестровье люди тоже знали, что дойдем.
Я, честно говоря, про Лиссабон думал. Ну, потому что это, сейчас к катку надо будет идти далеко. Притом я совершенно не шучу. То есть то, как сейчас все идет, то есть Одесса, Приднестровье, это уже все этапы, уже на этом все не закончится.
Don't stop at Transnistria, which is the western end of Ukraine. Go all the way to Lisbon, which is the capital of Portugal and the Atlantic Ocean. Must be reminded, of course, that Russia is still yet to take Bakhmut.